After obtaining her Ph.D. in applied mathematics and engineering science from Northwestern University, Dr. Gruis worked as an intelligence officer for the U.S. National Security Agency for 30 years. Early in her career, she developed disruptive technology solutions to difficult national security challenges and served as the first president of the NSA's Women in Mathematics Society. As a senior intelligence officer, Dr. Gruis contributed to the debate on alleged privacy abuses from the inside. And her last two assignments were at the U.S. Cyber Command and the National Intelligence Council at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Since retirement, Dr. Gruis maintains a strong interest in privacy, and I'm going to go and find her book. It's on my shelf right across the room, and has recently published a book on the topic. She also is mentoring STEM students in the K-12 setting. And tonight she's going to speak to us about privacy, giving us some historical context that brings us to many of the present ethical issues that we're facing today. So Dr. Gruis, welcome again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Razavi. Thank you very much for your kind invitation to speak tonight. And thank you for the kind invitation or the kind introduction which you provided. So, privacy, why should we care? This talk has been specially tailored to you entrepreneurs and aspiring entrepreneurs out there. And so my job is to make sure that you, as entrepreneurs, understand what the privacy issues are and why you should care about them in the future. So let's go ahead and get started. I have a quick synopsis here. These are all the things we're going to talk about. I realize that some of these slides are a little bit wordy. You guys do not have to race through and read this. The slides have been provided to Professor Razavi. You can review all these words at your leisure later. I will call out the things that are important on each slide, so don't feel like this is a speed reading test for you, okay? But these are the things we're going to talk about. First of all, we're going to talk about why privacy is essential to democracy. I'm going to mention why the government has always had a need for private information about its citizens. And then I'm going to talk about the technology era of the 20th century and thereafter, and how it's eroded privacy as it was envisioned in the Constitution. I'll make mention of the first privacy laws, and then we'll move on to the technology era when we started seeing the internet, cyber connectivity, and cyber threats, and how those posed serious problems for privacy. Then we'll do a little bit of review about best business practices, something you all probably have been exposed to already, and you will probably be beaten further over the head with in the future. We'll talk about how internet-enabled companies have been able to use, if you're the company, exploit, if you're the consumer, consumers' private information. And then I'll talk about what that means to you as entrepreneurs who have to keep up with this ever-changing privacy landscape. So let's get started with number one. Why is privacy essential to democracy? And what we're going to do is we're going to go way back in time to your years in high school. So that's got to be 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 years ago for some of you. And we're going to review some of the things you learned in US history class and in NSL. As entrepreneurs operating in a democratic system, under capitalism, you have to acknowledge that privacy is implicit amongst our democratic ideals. We see it in the First Amendment with its 5 freedoms: religion, speech, press, assembly, petition, all near and dear to our hearts as private rights we all hold. Another place you see privacy coming up is in the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment actually is derived from English constitutional law, way back, at least as far back as the 17th century. It's about being able to be secure in your person, your home, your papers, your stuff, all your stuff, against unreasonable searches and seizures by the government without a warrant issued under probable cause. So while we can see that privacy is implicit in our democratic ideals, these kinds of privacy rights have to be balanced, as you learned in your US history class, against the common good. Common good, that's a very confusing thing, but the common good is what the government helps make sure that we all enjoy. So the common good is making sure that the government is representative so that people suggest it, and it's functional, it has funding. Many of you probably remember reading the Federalist Papers when Alexander Hamilton was going on and on about having an income stream for this new nation and what a disaster previous attempts had brought. So what we have is a need for the government to have private information about its citizens, as the Constitution tells us, because in order to apportion representatives, those are your members of Congress, and taxes, we have to know how many people are in each state where. And so every 10 years, we do an enumeration. We call that enumeration the census. We had a census last year. The first census in the state of Maryland took place in 1790. And we've been doing it every 10 years ever since. So now, with that background, let's jump forward almost 200 years. I'm going to stop and I'm going to talk about some of the pictures on this slide. Again, we're still in US history. We're past the constitutional history. We're into the 20th century, right after World War II now, which usually gets short shift in US history class because they ran out of time, right? So I'll either remind you today or I'll give you an introduction to stuff that you should go and read about. So on the upper left-hand corner is a picture of a bomb. A bomb was a very early computer. The first bombs were built during World War II. This one lived in the United Kingdom, built by the Brits. Alan Turing, that famous mathematician that many people have heard of, was involved in this. And it was used to break the secret codes of the Germans, to break the Enigma machine. So what happened? World War II came, World War II went, and all of a sudden, all these countries had to move from these military war-based economies into peacetime economies. So what did the entrepreneurs do? Well, the entrepreneurs said, hey, we've built these great computers. I'm not sure what we're going to do with them because the military can only use so many. Let's diversify our offerings. Let's find a way to offer these machines to the civilian market. And what we find is computers start to migrate into the civilian markets in the United States. In the government, the first civilian use of a computer occurred in, not surprisingly, the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau got its first computer in 1951. It was a UNIVAC 1. And of course, they used it to help add up all the numbers of people in all the states and figure out who's where so we could apportion taxes and representation. Not only did the manufacturers have to rebadge their inventory for a civilian application, but all of a sudden, there were all those members of the military that were out of jobs. The war was over. They wanted to go back to their quiet lives back home and not travel the world anymore. What did they have to offer? They had new skills they had acquired during the wartime. They had skills in using computers. They had skills in all sorts of high-tech equipment. And they started finding ways to reapply those skills in the civilian market. They became people that helped with the design, development, and usage of computers. A theme which you'll see emerge here is that, of course, there were no laws about computers at that point in time. So the rule is technology moves faster, at least 3 times faster than real time, and law moves at least 3 times slower than real time. So there's a 9 times mismatch between how fast technology comes at you and how quickly US law can respond. If some of you say that's really distressing and I think that's terrible, remember, this is one of those features of a democratic system, right? All the constituents who elected people to go to Congress have a say. That's why it takes so long for new laws to be passed. What else happened after World War II? Well, if you've been following along, World War II, there was a race to Berlin between the Americans and the Soviets. And that was sort of the precursor to what became the Cold War. It was brimming on the surface at the end of World War II, but it really emerged shortly thereafter. And that's where you got things like the Marshall Plan, if you've ever heard of that, many of the other things that came. The middle picture shows a picture of the Soviet detonation of its first atomic bomb. That happened in 1949. That was way ahead of schedule compared to what all the experts in the United States thought. Maybe we were being arrogant, I don't know, but we were caught unawares. We were shocked, we were horrified. We all of a sudden felt like we were on an even footing technologically with our greatest enemy, communism and the Soviet state. What else happened? Well, a mere 8 years later, upper right, this little satellite named Sputnik came along in 1957. The Soviets were the first people to launch a satellite into space. Again, everybody in the United States, all the policy people, the government people, decision makers freaked out, right? They were like, oh my God, the Soviets beat us in the space race. Oh my God, what's going to happen? And their minds immediately jumped to the idea that you could combine things in space with nuclear weapons and make it possible to send nuclear missiles between continents from the Soviet Union to the United States. This was the big push for technology and space that occurred in the early 1960s. Along with that, also part of the Cold War was McCarthyism. That's in the lower left-hand corner. That's Uncle Joe right there, Joseph McCarthy. He had a Senate committee. The House had an Un-American Activities Committee. They were eternally searching for communists in the United States. Uncle Joe thought he had 241 he found in the State Department, and they beat up a bunch of Army guys over it. And we also raked Hollywood over the coals. People were blacklisted. Their reputations were ruined. They couldn't work. Some people immigrated. They left the country because it was so hostile to them. So we had that also going on during the Cold War. On top of that, the sort of icing on the cake was the early picture of the civil rights movement that had begun to evolve. Remember, during World War II, people of all colors and all races fought on behalf of the United States. Maybe the platoons weren't fully integrated, right? Maybe not everybody got to do the same thing, but many people from many different ethnicities served. And it gave people a sense that they had a right, having served their country, that they had a right to all the other rights that people had. Combined with the decision, again, US history, 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, right? People began to believe they had equal rights. And this civil rights movement would explode in the 1960s. So all these things came together all at one time. Now let me go back, and I'm going to talk about one of the early civilian uses of computers. And I'm going to talk about this particular one because it brought us our first privacy law, which was not the 1974 Privacy Act. So our first privacy law came along because of credit cards. Okay, now you guys all know what credit cards are today. It wasn't actually until about 1950, the first modern credit card as we know them was something called a Diners Club card, and it was invented in 1950. Other cards came along after that. There were airline cards, gasoline cards, travel cards, dining cards. Then the banks got in on the act, right? So then there were bank cards. And what happened? Well, there were a lot of entrepreneurs, the entrepreneurs of their era that said, you know, all these credit card companies are going to need a way to decide who is a good credit risk to extend credit to. And so what happened is we see something rise called credit reporting agencies, which are still with us today. And these credit reporting agencies started using computers. They were using computers to accumulate all this information about what consumers were doing, what they were buying, what debt they had, whether they had a mortgage, had they defaulted on a loan, did they have a steady job, where did they go to school, yada, yada, on and on. Remember that credit cards and computers have just emerged, right? The law hasn't even thought about this stuff in 1950 yet. It's going to take another 20 years until 1970 before Congress passes the first privacy law. And the first privacy law was this one, the Fair Credit Reporting Act. People always give these things nicknames. So the nicknames of this one is FCRA. You just sort of pronounce all the letters together at once. Now, I know there are too many words on this slide for you guys to completely digest, but the important thing to note at this point in time is this is the first time that someone had written down the principles of privacy all in one place, and they had been incorporated in a law by Congress. So every time you read anything, a privacy agreement, a privacy law, a regulation, it will be reminiscent of the points made here. So now that we have our first privacy law, I want to go on and talk a little bit more about technology, because I've talked about computers. But also at this point in time, as the Cold War is rising, 1960, 1965, lots of unrest in the United States, civil rights movements, assassinations of a president and his brother, yada, yada, on and on. The Cold War continues to rise, and the Department of Defense says, you know, it would be really nice, if we could start to network together all the academic centers of excellence we have in this country to help us with our national security, to help the academics be able to share information more easily. And we would also like to include some of the labs that still exist as a result of World War II. So you'll see in that bottom left picture, there's a circle on the right-hand side, and you'll see Lincoln. That's Lincoln Labs up in Massachusetts that had contributed to the radar effort during World War II. They wanted to include those labs and universities in this network. And so the Department of Defense funded what they came to call ARPANET, starting in 1969, with a modest 4 nodes to begin with. And then you see how it began to grow over time. Now, I'm sure you guys know the punchline here. The punchline is that ARPANET grew. It was a government thing. Eventually, it was privatized, and it became the internet that we know today. Now, what's interesting about this picture here is that I haven't drawn a picture of all the terrestrial networks that provide the internet inside countries. I've given you a picture of all the undersea cables that connect continents. Okay, there was a business case for every one of these cables to be laid. Okay, these cables are tremendously expensive. It takes big consortiums of organizations to fund and manage to install and maintain these cables. And yet there is a business case to install this many cables. I'd say 99% plus are now fiber optic cables between the continents of North America, South America, Europe, Africa, and it goes on and on around the rest of the world. And so what happens? Now we have all these cables. We're able to send information back and forth quickly, efficiently, using all those great protocols that all those smart people designed. And what happens? What happens is it introduces a new threat environment. Okay, just as these cables can be installed, so can they be damaged, and so can their success be thwarted by cyber attacks. Okay, we're not going to talk about physical damage to cables today, although it is a problem. We're going to talk about the cyber threat. Here, I've shown a picture. This is one utility that's out there that kind of shows how threats can propagate from places as far away as Peru to Thailand, back to Europe, and so on and so on. This is just one snapshot in time. Right? If you were looking at this in real time, it would be exactly like that scene in war games where you see things flying across the screen back and forth, right? Until you almost can't see the screen anymore, okay? This is just a snapshot in time. And so now we're finding that our networked world, while it's very convenient in many ways and very appealing to a lot of entrepreneurs, also poses some threats to us. And what are these threats about? Well, not only do these threats threaten our network technology, but they also pose risks to the private information we share in cyberspace. I'm sure many of you are familiar with all the different kinds of cyber attacks that are out there. Right now, ransomware is very well covered in the news and is really a very serious problem. These kinds of attacks pose serious privacy risks. And not only are they privacy risks, but the threats themselves are asymmetric. So what does asymmetric mean? Asymmetric means not symmetric, right? A way of understanding it is I can say a committed cyber attacker needs to only succeed once. If you're a cyber defender, you have to bat 1,000, right? You have to try to catch every volley the attacker throws and thwart their success. That is a nearly impossible task. And so what happens is we don't talk about cybersecurity prevention or privacy risk prevention. We talk about managing risk, right? One single cyber attack can cascade, just like a drop of water becomes a stream, becomes a river, becomes an ocean. A single cyber effect from Thailand can propagate worldwide quite quickly and provide internet outages for people, can cause huge financial consequences to businesses, and can pose serious legal repercussions to individuals. So how do companies manage risk? Well, you guys are all smart entrepreneur students. So you know all about best business practices. Or if you don't know about all about best business practices, you're about to know about best business practices, right? And we generally categorize those under the principles of governance, risk management, and compliance. And I'm not going to belabor this. This could be a whole class. What I really want to highlight is the risk management aspect. Companies manage risk using risk management. They try to identify the risks, assess them, reduce them, and manage them. And they have lots of different techniques for doing that. So when it comes to their network infrastructure and the protection of private information, I imagine it won't surprise you very much to learn that companies use these tried and true risk management techniques to manage cyber risks and privacy risks. So you say, that's great. But you know what? Risk management doesn't always work, right? Sometimes companies get themselves in strife. What happens then? Well, what happens then is exactly what we're seeing going on right now. If you look at the news today, tomorrow, yesterday, and next week, all those internet-enabled goods and services that you see being offered, and we like to pick on the big tech people, right? The Facebooks, the Amazons, Microsoft, Google, Apple. All these guys have been enabled by the internet, and they are ending up in legal strife on a regular basis, right? Just suppose for a moment you were Mark Zuckerberg. Do you suppose Mark Zuckerberg loves coming to Washington to testify before Congress all the time? That must just be, at first, I think it was a nightmare, and now it's just a recurring chore for him because he is here all the time defending his position. This is the kind of environment you are launching yourselves into as entrepreneurs in the future. So instead of trying to talk about what's going on today, because that's a moving target and it's almost impossible to keep track day to day about what fine Google's paying today and how much trouble Facebook is in with the Federal Trade Commission today, I'm going to do a case study from nearly 20 years ago. And I'm going to talk about Sarbanes-Oxley, which was a law that Congress passed back in 2002 in wake of something called the Enron scandal. If you guys don't know the Enron scandal, not to worry, just type into Wikipedia and you can get all the gory details. Basically, they passed the law to help protect investors from fraudulent financial reporting by corporations. There was also an accounting firm that went down in the middle of this named Arthur Andersen as well. Congress was not amused, okay? They were so not amused that they passed this law, which was much stricter than the laws that had been on the books before. Now you have to remember, there were lots of laws already at this point in time regulating the behavior of public corporations like this, right? So as a matter of fact, the regulator who was relevant here, which is the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, had been around since 1934. And the SEC was actually created because of the 1929 stock market crash, Okay, so they've been around the block a few times. They've seen it all before. They've tried to make the best rules they can. They've tried to work with Congress. And yet, even then, these investors manage to provide fraudulent reporting and lose a lot of people's money, sadly. And so Congress made up a whole bunch of rules for these publicly held companies to follow. So now, if you're the CEO or CFO, you have to certify that your quarterly and annual reports are truthful. And if anybody alters those documents or falsifies those documents, they may face criminal penalties. They could suffer loss of reputation. They could be dragged into court and tried on criminal charges. They could be hit with huge fines. If there's somebody who is licensed, like an attorney, they might lose their license. They can even go to jail now. What also happened is it gave the SEC more power. The Securities and Exchange Commission was now able to oversee the auditing of public companies and establish auditing standards. And then at the very end, I talk a little bit about how auditors are certified. And now in this changing era, chief information officers may need to be certified in CISP or CISA. So why am I making such a big deal about all this? If you want to be an entrepreneur, you have to follow all these rules. Now, these rules, of course, apply only to public companies, but this is the current mood that people are in. If you want to look at what is going to happen in the future with the big tech companies, with Facebook, with Google, et cetera, you need to look at this example as a lesson in history about what might happen next to these big tech companies. So let's bring this back to today. You as entrepreneurs want to use all the information that is available to you from your internet-based customer transactions in order to improve your revenue stream. I get that. But sometimes perhaps companies overstep their bounds. They don't think about the privacy rights of individuals, right? There's no law prohibiting certain behaviors. It's really a question of ethical behavior that perhaps big tech is failing to exercise. So while big tech is monetizing my private information and your private information, the world is starting to push back. We're starting to see laws, regulations, and norms pushing against the privacy exploitation that we see in internet-based consumer transactions. In Europe, the Europeans have already passed a regulation, the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, and that imposes privacy rules. And those privacy rules protect all European citizens. So, for example, if you are a US company doing business with Europeans, you have to follow GDPR now. That's the law. If you don't follow GDPR, and many of the big tech companies have discovered this already, they will bring you up on charges. They will try you in court. They will impose huge fines on you. Okay, they're very serious about this. In the United States, we're starting to see state laws that are imposing statewide privacy rules. I put the California flag up there because that was one of the first and most popularly discussed privacy laws out of the gate. It was first the California Consumer Privacy Act, and more recently, the California Privacy Rights Act. So if you're Washington, sitting here in the middle, Europe to one side of you, the states to the other side of you, you're getting squeezed between all these privacy laws, right? The Europeans are saying these privacy rules, and California is saying we have these privacy rules. Now, if you're a company, a little company or a big tech company, doesn't matter. If you're a company, would you rather subscribe to 50 individual statewide privacy laws, or would you prefer to have one federal privacy law? Okay, it's starting to make sense for Congress to think about a new privacy law to protect consumers' private information. I've already talked a lot about how the Securities and Exchange Commission was given more authorities by Congress to rein in public companies. By the same stroke, another regulator, the Federal Trade Commission, has been exercising more and more authority in terms of consumer privacy. So Federal Trade Commission, been around for a long time, originally created for antitrust, anti-monopoly efforts, now steps into the consumer protection arena, and now most recently, the consumer privacy arena. That's a big player, but they only have so many powers to rein big tech in, okay? They actually do not prosecute companies like Facebook. They bring inquiries, but it's up to the Department of Justice to pursue prosecution if that's appropriate. And Facebook and all the other companies end up with huge fines, and they get slapped on the wrist and they say, I won't do that again. And then next week they're back again and we go around again. So perhaps the time is ripe for new privacy law. Perhaps Congress will move out on a new privacy law. But of course, the success of congressional laws is based largely on constituents like you and me, right? Why is it based on constituents? Well, if you don't like what your congressperson is doing, you cannot vote for them next time, okay? So they have to reflect the mood of their districts or their states. And fortuitously, constituents are becoming more and more aware of information privacy issues, more and more well-versed in what the big tech companies are getting away with, more sensitive to protecting their private information. And so they're going to be clamoring more to their congresspeople for greater privacy protection. If you're an aspiring entrepreneur, like you kids today, you must be sensitive to this changing privacy landscape. The rules are changing basically every day. Okay, now there are rules that basically say, if you're a big company, then you have big responsibilities and you can have big negative repercussions. And if you're a little company and you made your best effort, we're really not going to go after you. So I don't want you all to panic and freak out and decide that you all want to do something else with your lives just because of what I said. It's not that bad, okay? But you need to be sensitive to this for the future because it's forever changing. So let me review what we've covered today. I've explained to you why you as entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs should want to protect privacy. It's absolutely essential to our democracy, and it's essential to the success of our capitalistic system, right? If you want to make money in our capitalistic market, you need to support privacy and democracy. The government has always had a need for private information in order to determine how many taxes and how many representatives need to be given to each state and each district. We've seen how technology eroded the privacy that was indirectly described in the Constitution. We've seen how privacy laws lag behind technology, right? Computers came about in World War II. They started to go to the private sector in the 50s. Credit cards came along in the 50s, but the first privacy laws didn't show up until 1970. The threats posed by a networked world are asymmetric. And so therefore the threats posed to privacy are asymmetric. One vulnerability can compromise an entire database of private information. And we have seen that happen again and again and again. If you're a company, you're going to manage privacy risks exactly the same way you manage all your other risks, right? You're going to use a template or a framework or whatever the best business practice is, that's what you're going to do. So it's not as hopelessly difficult as you think, right? Companies and corporations have been managing risk for a long time. This is just a variation on the theme. Our internet networked world has allowed companies to take advantage of consumers' private information to get you to spend money, perhaps on things you might not have spent money on, right? The fact that I once bought a book on 16th century navigation, and 3 years later, Amazon sends me an ad for a book on 17th century navigation suggests to me that Amazon has a really long memory. Okay, I don't know if I'm okay with that. Okay, you shouldn't be okay with that either. From a business point of view, it's fantastic, right? But from a privacy point of view, it's kind of scary. If you're going to be an entrepreneur in this world today, you're going to need to keep up with this ever-changing landscape that we see for privacy as it evolves.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And it's so nice to hear you talk about what you've actually described in your book in a way that is geared towards the interests of people who are beginning their careers and what they're entering. So I totally appreciate that. For those of you who did not see the picture of the book, I can share my copy. I'm hoping that you can see that. Do I have my, whoops. Yes, I can't see myself, but I'm assuming that you can see that. And you can see that it's getting all earmarked as I've been digging into it. It's really fascinating reading. The first part of the book is a lot of the history that you shared with us today, and it's called Past, Present, and Future. So it really does take us up to what we need to know about what's happening today and going forward. There were a couple of areas that I was hoping that you could speak to, Dr. Gruis, and they come out of what you were talking about today and also what I've been reading in your book. And the first one you mentioned tonight, the importance of privacy to our democracy. You have a great quote in here. I don't know that I can find it quickly, but that sort of explains that democracy is threatened when people's privacy is threatened. And I'm just wondering if you can kind of unpack that for us. So that was my first question.
So let me say, I can speak with confidence on this subject, not because I'm a lawyer, but because there are a lot of really smart lawyers that make this point. So I think the first person I read where I came across this idea was a guy named Lawrence Lessig. And he wrote a book back in 1999 called Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. And he coined the phrase East Coast Code, by which he means the laws that Congress passes, and West Coast Code, the computer code that West Coast companies write and implement that we use every day. And so there's this underlying theme in his talk about how democracy is preserved by the private information that we keep to ourselves, and that this West Coast code kind of subverts the East Coast code in a lot of ways, partly because the code lags behind what the technology speeds ahead. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. And to me, it's particularly interesting because I think what I understood was that people have to have the ability to vote, for example, without in privacy. And that if that privacy is breached, then it can impact the ability of a democracy to continue to flourish with actually people being represented by their values. So I'm interested in that partly because of what's happening in some of our landscape where people's personal data is being requested by officials who run elections. And so it gets really messy, and that there are lobbyists in Congress who are going to be supporting that kind of breach of privacy. So it sounds like it's a real sticky wicket, but it's
a
really
very
important.
wicked, and I do not have the legal expertise. One of the hardest things about writing this book was I did not have a background in the law. So I was eternally bugging all my lawyer friends to explain things to me.
That's great. Well, and you cite all of the legal precedent in here, so anyone who is a lawyer or studying law or interested in the law can certainly go back and find that. Yeah. So there is a question in the chat, so I'm going to move to that. Could you describe your journey deciding to write a book about privacy, and what about the topic of privacy inspired you to begin this process of writing a book?
So that's a really interesting question. I lived through the 1970s as a teenager in Washington, D.C. I remember the privacy law. I remember the 1960s too, for that matter. I remember the riots in D.C. I remember the privacy law. I remember the church committee hearings. I remember all those things, okay? And so I've always been a patriot. Okay, and so when I went to work for the National Security Agency, we were always scrupulous about protecting individual privacy. And so I sort of came by knowledge of it, I guess I'd say serendipitously, but I was always curious about its roots, how we got here. Why did we have the conventions we do? What does common good mean anyway? What does privacy mean? Why can't I find that word in the Constitution? Right? I'm so confused. Somebody explain this to me. I'm just a mathematician, right? Those were all the questions that were percolating in my brain. And then one day at work, I was talking to a really smart guy. He was a Harvard lawyer, really brilliant guy. And I was talking to him about privacy, my favorite subject. And he finally looked at me and he said, "Leslie, just write the book." I said, "Oh, yeah, I guess I could." And that's really what launched the book, was him saying, if you're confused about this, so are a lot of people. So you should sit down and research it and write it down in a not legal style, right? So that people who aren't lawyers can understand how we got here. That's how I got to writing a book.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. If other people have questions, looks like my chat forum is frozen. Hopefully they'll pop up. In the meantime, one of my other questions is about the term that you use in your book is privacy pirates, and you're talking about Facebook and Google and those huge entities that use our data to sell us things, and you mentioned that in your talk too. And the other term that you use that I think is really just fascinating is you talked about they're using behavioral data. So it's not necessarily data that you might find on a database about us, but our activities on the internet. Like you said, if you buy a book, then 10 years later, they'll come back and they'll try to sell you the next volume of that book. So I guess my question is, and that could be considered market research. So do you see like a gray area, or is there a line, like an ethical line where market research becomes unethical, which would be something for our entrepreneurs to think about?
So this is a really hard question, and something I've actually been thinking about a lot is the ethics of what we do. Obviously, when you look at best business practices, it's up to the executive team to set the tone at the top. Right? If they have sloppy business practices, its workforce will have sloppy business practices. If they are scrupulously ethical, then they have an expectation that their workforce will be scrupulously ethical. So there's that aspect of it. We're seeing a lot of play in this in the computer science and engineering community, especially with regards to artificial intelligence, right? And I am certainly not an expert on this, but I will say that people have always had a fear that the machines will take over. And so there are always these ongoing debates about how much can you trust a machine to do? What kind of decisions can it make? They're not sentient. They don't have emotions. they can't make a human ethical decision like I would make a human ethical decision. And that's sort of the source of that whole debate. That debate's been going on ever since the idea of machines came around, right? But it's just a little bit more shrill at this point in time because of artificial intelligence. So I don't know what the answer is. I do know if you're doing research that for clinical research, for example, for psychology or something like that, there have been techniques in the past where individual data is privatized or anonymized or combined in a way so that you can't identify the individual, and yet you can have the benefit of the data in order to do your research. And so those kinds of rules exist, whether that can always be backwards engineered or not backwards engineered. There seems to be a debate going on about that right now as well. It's all a very delicate balancing act, right? I think that the privacy pirates will be forced to behave with greater privacy concern and more ethical behavior in the future. If nothing else, Congress and the regulators are going to keep slapping them upside the head, and so are the Europeans.
Well, good. Well, that's that's good to know. Yeah, so it sounds like maybe there are things that you could do that would make it more like research where you would have protections against using things for individual profit that might help move market research from an unethical to a more ethical position.
I will tell you there are behaviorists, and I'm trying to think of his name. His last name is Pinker, and it's a guy, not a woman. It's not Susan Pinker, it's the other Pinker. They're brother and sister, actually. And he has sort of picked up on some of the work that the psychologist Skinner did. Mm-hmm. In terms of controlling human populations using behavioral levers. And there is a very, I don't know if you would call it utopian or dystopian view that if you could control the behaviors of all people, that you would eradicate famine, war, strife, all the bad things in the world. Now, I don't buy that, but there are some researchers that are sort of at that extreme today.
Wow. Yeah, I did. That actually does come up in your book, and that did catch my, caught my attention in a kind of a scary way. There are some scary things. Another scary thing that is in your book that I wonder if you might talk to is you talk about the social credit score in China, that we have our credit score that's based on our financial records, but that there's a movement towards collecting other sorts of information that might have some pretty value-laden characteristics, like whether you're a parent might improve your score, and whether you play, I think video games was in your book, as something that might lower your social credit score. Do you see anything like that happening in the United States, or any direction in that, or any movement in that direction?
Absolutely not. That's the antithesis of what democracy is about.
Okay, good.
I just don't see that.
Good. Well, good to hear that. That's another one.
I will move away if they go that way. Right? I'll move out.
Yeah, well, it's scary enough that it's happening anywhere in the world. So I just wanted us to kind of have that on our radar.
There's a basic difference between us and the Chinese, right? So we believe in democracy. They believe in totalitarianism. Now, a great thing about totalitarianism is you can get everybody to agree to do what the government says because you don't have a choice. Okay, it makes them very efficient. Okay, that makes it tough competition for us. But I would not train our freedoms for the world, right? That is not what democracy is about. It's about being able to exercise your individual rights as long as you don't hurt anybody else, right? And that's sort of the bottom line. So yes, you should be reassured, Rodrigo, we will not see that coming anytime soon. And just in case anybody's worried about Facebook and the amount of power they have over you, I have a very easy solution. Don't use it. Just get off, right? I would love to see Mark Zuckerberg's company go to a value of 0 if everybody just quit.
That's an interesting place for us to end our discussion tonight.